Hi, this is Lex, and welcome to the FinTech Blueprint. It's your podcast about fintech, decentralized finance, digital banking, investing, robo-advice, artificial intelligence, and all the other frontier technology that is transforming financial services. To get more content, like an illustrated transcript of this conversation in your inbox, subscribe at fintechblueprint.com. So without further delay, let's jump into today's episode. Welcome, everybody. I'm really excited about our conversation today. We have Dimitri Dadiomov, who is the CEO and co-founder at Modern Treasury. We're going to be talking about fintech, about payment software, about founding companies, and I'm really excited to have a conversation with him. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So where we start in trying to understand how folks got on their fintech journey and the different parts of their career that influenced the things that they've built along the way. Can we start a little bit with your entry into the industry and how that came together?
Yeah, certainly. I grew up with both of my parents are computer scientists. I grew up in Seattle. Both of them had worked at Microsoft when I was growing up. So I kind of grew up with a lot of tech around the dinner table. And I wanted to join and work and potentially start, tech startups. That was something that I was very interested in going back to college. And so I really started my career working in product and business development roles at early stage companies. And in 2015, I joined Lending Home, which is an online mortgage company. And in that role, we ended up coming across a lot of the problems that we're solving with Modern Treasury today. But really, it was being a PM focused on the investor side of the marketplace at Lending Home that led me and my co-founders, Sam and Matt, who were at Lending Home with me as well, led us to understand a lot of the complexities that go into payment operations at companies that move money as a core part of their product or service. And that was the beginning of the journey of Modern Treasury.
So I'm going to ask you a naive question, and sometimes people don't know just the meanings of these words, especially when you're looking at things from finance. You have certain roles, and when you're looking at things from tech, you have different career paths. You mentioned that you were PM, a product manager. What is a product manager from a tech perspective?
It's a great question. So I think it's a question that most PMs ask themselves every day. I think at a very high level, the product manager role is really about setting forth a strategy and a product kind of ideation and then actually executing on it and working with different teams inside the company, coordinating between engineering, design, data, sales to bring a product to market and to bring a product to a customer or prospect and take them on a customer journey that makes sense and understand what are the things that can help solve real problems for customers? What are things that can nudge a prospect that's not entirely sure if this is the right product for them or not to experiment and try and ultimately become a daily user, weekly user, whatever makes sense in the context of the product. So for me, in my case, I was very focused on, as I said, the investor side of the marketplace, meaning we built a peer-to-peer experience for individuals to go and invest in the loans that Lending Home was producing. And so you can kind of think of it as an e-commerce shopping cart where you'd log on and see a lot of different loans and properties that were being renovated. And you'd be able to invest in a particular one or create a portfolio of many different loans and get your reporting and things like that as an investor. And so just bringing all that together into an experience that is cohesive and coherent and makes sense is really ultimately the role of the PM.
It's a really difficult role, and it's so hard to actually be customer centric and know what people want and what your customers are telling you versus what it is that the market is telling you and navigating that. You did both the investing side as well as kind of gotten yourself into the lending business, and you said the payments business, payments operations while you were there. Can you talk a little bit about the exposure you had to financial product and sort of what role financial product played relative to the technology piece?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think this is a very central question to a lot of fintech products. And really, fintech as a category can be very widely separated. There's sort of a spectrum of new innovations, some of them being purely financial innovations and relatively easy and straightforward as far as technical kind of implementation. There's others that are the opposite, which are technically incredibly difficult, but actually are mimicking or making something that's relatively already available. So, I think for the product that we were offering at Leningham still offers, really Leningham was born out of kind of post 2008 crisis and an observation that there's a lot of activity in the US and I'm sure broadly as well, where individuals or companies are coming in and buying a property and renovating it and selling it, because a lot of people want to live in a nice new house, but they want to have the exposed red brick and they want to live in the studio and they want to live in the city and things like that become hard to kind of deliver as a new construction piece. So somebody has to go buy an old property and renovate it and hopefully sell it or rent it in 6 or 12 months time. And financing that as a financial product was something that was relatively unavailable. There was a lot of loans kind of that were available at the at the country club, if you will, that were not very much an institutionalist product. And Leningham and a number of other companies really came to that and brought it to a web experience that's more modern. So there's sort of a financial innovation of how do you bring Wall Street, how do you bring institutional capital into a new part of the economy that it hasn't prior to this been present in. And there's also the technical innovation of how do you build a website and how do you build an understanding and a flow of information for investors to feel comfortable that they know what they're investing in, that they know what it is that they're getting in return for their money, and that all the reporting comes back and things like that. So I think, going back to the earlier question around what is the job of the PM, this is true for any product, but certainly true in fintech. You have to understand the financial product reality and how does this product that you have compete in the capital market, if you will, as well as on the other side, how does it technically work and how do you execute it and how do you make sure that it's scalable and reliable and works well and the UI is good and things like that. And so that certainly contributes to the complexity of being an excellent PM in the fintech world specifically, because you have to bridge the two. And it depends on what type of product you're working on. In some cases, it's not a capital markets thing, it's something else. But, in the payment world, you have to understand how banks work and banking, or there's always something that isn't just purely how does the HTML show up on the page, but actually how does this product work in the broader, economy and why is it attractive for somebody to buy it or use it or invest in it or something like that.
Right. I imagine that these were chunky financings. Like these are large, meaningful amounts for people that are behaviorally difficult. They're at a point of their life where they're probably making a financial decision that is complicated, and yet the rails aren't really in place. The modern rails aren't really in place to get this done easily. Can you talk a little bit about the beginnings of your insights around payment operations and embedded finance, and kind of what pulled you from this initial experience towards Modern Treasury?
For sure. It was a problem that we had as we grew. So Leningham, by the time, by 2017 or so, was probably about 300 people as a company and was scaling up pretty nicely. Was doing about $1 billion in origination. And within that, there was, tens of thousands of transactions that were flying around, wires funding actual loans that are going out to borrowers, ACH debits, collecting that every month, kind of book transfers, taking those ACH debits and putting them in the right place, and then eventually deposits and withdrawals on the investor side that can happen over different payment types. And so all of a sudden, we were kind of in this world where there was just like tens of thousands of payments flying around. These things were showing up as transactions on bank statements. We had some systems to automate certainly the initiation of those payments, because we were able to connect the website, if you will, to the bank and be able to facilitate those payments. But a lot of the reconciliation problems that were showing up, people saying, what is this to a bank statement? A lot of customer service problems where, somebody was calling and saying, hey, I don't think this payment that I'm owed got here yet. Where is it? And, the question becomes, what is the person on the phone, the customer service rep on the phone, what are they looking at and how do they actually answer that question? And so we started having a lot of these problems, and, Lenny Home was growing nicely, but, it was a bigger company, but wasn't yet massive the way that some other companies around us were. And so we started doing what I think a lot of, PMs and founders try to do, which is run around and try to find people who have faced the same problem before and try to understand, well, how did they solve it, and what can we learn from that, and what are the next stages, what happens when you kind of look down the road a little bit. And so I remember just talking to friends of friends and trying to ask, how does Uber do this? How does Airbnb do this? How does AngelList do this? Very different use cases, but all those companies just moving tons of money for different, marketplaces, for gig economy, payouts, for equity crowdfunding. But the thing that's true is there's a website and there's a transaction that is facilitated from that website. And then somehow that has to be reconciled and accounted for and audited and things like that. And so that led us down the road of realizing that actually every one of those companies, once we met like a friend, eventually we would meet somebody who was part of the money team or the payments team. And that team was kind of building the same thing. Obviously, in some cases, like in Airbnb's case, it is incredibly global, which is not a problem that we necessarily had at Lenny Home. But it was one of those problems that really was pretty horizontal and didn't feel very specific to mortgages or to funding startups or to ride sharing or something. It just felt very horizontal and something that should exist across different banks, across different accounting systems, across different use cases. And that kind of led us down that road where when we started thinking about all the things that we really wanted to build in order to solve our own problems, on the one hand, none of it felt very mortgage specific. On the other hand, it felt very applicable to a lot of companies that we already knew. And that was the start of the Modern Treasury journey.
It's fantastic how, the growth of one part of the industry or the digitization of one part of the industry just exposes this legacy architecture, whether it's payments or banking infrastructure, to be so insufficient for the task of running huge live systems across multiple industries in real time. This is a bit of a naive question, but I want to ask it anyway, which is, why didn't things work? Like, why wasn't there an answer? What were the banks not doing, when you were trying to put something together? Because there's all this talk about digital transformation and open banking and APIs and so on. But clearly that isn't in the marketplace in a meaningful way from traditional institutions. Can you talk about how you saw that and maybe some of the underlying causes of that gap?
Yeah, I don't think it's a naive question at all. It's a question that I've wrestled with for the first year or two of this company's life, which is try to figure out why nobody had built it before. There was a moment when it started feeling like, okay, like I'm pretty sure that I know who'd use it and what they'd use it for. And the applications are very omnipresent. You keep kind of running into them. And so like, why didn't it exist? Like, why has nobody built it? And I think I sort of realized at least a partial answer to that, which is something that is a tailwind that we didn't even think about when we started the company. But if you rewind back to, 2000 or 2005 or something like that, and you think about commerce on the internet. So the internet is like a new thing. 2005, like the internet existed for 10 years, right? And people were very uncertain about putting a credit card number into a web form. There was this kind of visceral feeling that people had about, I don't know if I trusted, they would get like an extra credit card that would be just their like web credit card. And they would not sort of trust their main credit card with putting it into the for paying for things on the internet. And the problems that people were solving, if you think about kind of the big startup successes of that era, were things like, how do I buy a book, right, like on Amazon? And how do I subscribe to something like Netflix? How do I buy a flight on, Orbitz or Kayak or something like that? And those types of successes really operate on credit cards. So credit card commerce was the fundamental problem in like web commerce in general. And you've had a number of companies that showed up around 2007, 8, 9, 10, Braintree, Stripe, Adyen, et cetera, that have like built a lot of infrastructure to solve that problem. And I think that there was something about Lenny Home getting started in 2013 it was early in a class of companies that sort of couldn't have existed 10 years earlier, that are really working in the intersection of the internet, but also industries like real estate and healthcare and education and so on, where you really don't operate in those industries on credit cards. You really operate on, at least in the US domestic context, you operate on over ACH wire, paper check, things like that. And so all of a sudden you had these companies that we were able to go run around and talk to who were innovating. Another great example of this is Gusto, like doing payroll. Like there's no credit card in the payroll flow. You take money from a company, you send funds over to employees and to tax agencies and so on. None of that happens over credit card. It all happens over ACH wire and check. And so I think one of the reasons why I don't think that if we had, or somebody had tried to start Modern Treasury 10 years earlier, I don't think it would have worked. So, because I don't think there's a lot of companies that were trying to solve problems and mess with parts of the economy that really needed this type of infrastructure. And I think the world's very different now, where we're seeing a lot more need for that. But the companies in the 10 to 15 era that needed to build this, they all have their own internal payment type teams, and they're very proud of a lot of the things they built, as they should be, because it's really hard stuff to build. But if you're starting today, there's no scenario where you would really want to build that scale of internal payment infrastructure as an engineering matter.
That's fascinating and really insightful, right? You first have the economy, the real economy, move in a certain platform shift or a certain direction, and then you have finance kind of wrap around it with features that it brings, and you can't put the infrastructure before the actual use case. There's no point. And so it's just like such a rapid expansion that brings with it these new types of rails. I want to ask you about, and you've touched on this a little bit already, but who Modern Treasury is for. And I think this is really fundamental too. You have this positioning around APIs, you have this positioning that it's built for developers, and there's a bit of stuff around, the CFO suite and for folks who are running a business. Can you talk a bit about like the customer segment, within the go-to-market motion, who the purchaser is, and then how you think about wrapping the product towards them?
Absolutely. We believe that Modern Treasury is for companies of very different sizes, meaning that we have startups that are 3, 4, 5 people that are using us, and we have public companies that are using us. And that's really important, because I think as a product, we aim to be the right product for you that can scale with you. You can start early and you sort of live with, and there's new, functionality that sort of opens up and unlocks. I almost think of it as a video game, right? Like starting a company is a video game where you kind of unlock new levels and you need new things. And sometimes the products that got you through a certain phase, you sort of discard and you go to the next version of that product. And sometimes you can actually live with them for a long time. And so kind of going back to maybe the Microsoft upbringing, I think a lot about how do you build a platform and a product that actually just lives with you forever. Like Bill Gates's famous sort of mission was a computer in every desk in every home. So that's very ambitious. That's presuming within it is this computer is doing anything you're doing, in the office or at home. And of course, they sort of got that mission delivered on it. But I think a lot about how do you make sure that this product actually lives with you from the early days to later. And as the company grows, the complexity and the roles actually change. So to answer your question, who is it for? It's for anybody who is moving money as a core part of their product or service. So if you are building a product, whether it's a fintech company or a marketplace or a real estate company or an education company or what have you, and you have a flow in your website or in your app where at some point you initiate a payment, could be a credit, could be a debit, but it's a very generic thing. But if you initiate a payment, you have to be able to transfer and translate that into bank speak, and you need to be able to record and audit and account for everything that happened. And so the buyer initially in the early stage companies, usually there is no, head of finance at a 5-person startup. There's usually, it's a CTO, founder, kind of maybe product sale, where somebody's trying to build a product and they say, I need an easy API. I need to have a dashboard that will have my webhook logs or what have you. And so it becomes very much a developer kind of sale in that sense. But as the company grows, all of a sudden, maybe the company becomes a 50-person company, and now there's a head of finance, and that head of finance owns the banking relationship and is understandably thinking about and maybe even worried about control of the bank account that the engineering team has. And so how do you provide, there's a saying that, good fences make good neighbors. So what is the fence? How does the finance team have visibility and understand what the engineering team is doing over these APIs, over the open banking APIs that exist. And so you have to create a dashboard for them and rules and an ability to stop things if they're outside of certain rules that they feel comfortable with. They want to make sure that they're manually release something. And then, later on when the payment actually shows up as a line item on a statement, how do you tie all the context that came from the original API call and the original intent for like why somebody came to Coinbase, the app, and said deposit, and like they know everything about that person. They know who it is. They know at what point in time did they hit deposit. They probably even know what device they're on, all that sort of thing. How do you capture all that so that the person who is doing month close can actually say, oh yeah, we debited Dimitri for 50K because he did a deposit. Like being able to connect all that to a line item on a statement is a really important function. And so how do you provide the dashboard and the magic view for that? And, as the company grows, I think there's just more and more of these magic views. There's the customer service use case, there's the audit use case, there's accounting use case, there's other problems that show up all the time that we're seeing as we get into larger companies. And, so there's a lot of different users for it, but it's really for anybody who is building a product that needs to tie the engineering, if you will, function to money movement through the banking system.
The word finance, it's so dangerous, even in a company like that you're describing as a potential client. Like you've got the finance function for whom being able to tie the money flows into accounting statements and be able to represent what it is that the firm is doing from just like a raw operations perspective, that's a huge challenge, and tooling for the financial suite of a business, has seen tons of investment and ton of progress, and like you said, you don't have to be a fintech to benefit from that. And then on the other side of that, you also have the finance products like the payments products, the money movement products, or connectivity to deposits and banks, right? And you've got companies that are selling financial products or causing financial flows on behalf of customers that are trying to get people invested or that are trying to on-ramp them into something else. I know you've articulated this before, but how do you think about the primary stakeholder? Which side of the network do you start with, or is that even the right way to frame it?
I don't know that there's a primary stakeholder. I mean, to some degree, we'll work with whoever is tasked inside the company to solve this problem, and it can change. I mean, some companies, in our observation, there's companies that are very tech first, and they focus on kind of trying to automate everything and build everything before they really get meaningful scale. And there's other companies that are more ops heavy, and they will do things much more manually for much longer, and only then come back and fully automate it. And there's pros and cons to both approaches. And sometimes in the let's automate first kind of mentality, usually it's a product or technical engineering kind of driven conversation. And in the latter, it's oftentimes an operations or finance driven conversation. I think every case is a little bit different. As a product person, I think about how does this product work for both, right? How does this product actually make sense? I mean, if you think about something like Excel, maybe as a tool that a lot of people are very familiar with, you have people who are really using Excel just for to-do lists and aren't using any of the fancy kind of math formulas. And there's people who are building crazy macros that run into the tens of thousands of rows. And so how does that product actually work well for both? I think about that a lot. So we have companies that are doing tens or maybe hundreds of payments per month. That is like 5 people. And we have companies that are doing hundreds of thousands of payments, and obviously a lot of the user journeys and reporting flows and things like that change between them. But how do you make sure that actually the product just works for both and delivers on its promise of like, hey, I'm going to make this part of your product easy. Like you have a hard job building this company, you're trying to revolutionize real estate or healthcare or what have you. You don't need to worry about the banking and payment ops and accounting side of it. We'll take care of it. Like that I think has to be true for different size companies.
Gotcha. Makes sense. I guess an adjacent question would be around partnerships and integrations and getting a sense of where you are relative to other software or embedded finance providers in the space. One thing going through your site that stuck out at me is the direct piping you have to some of the large banks. How did that get kicked off? Like how do you choose where you want to build from scratch versus where you are working through partners? And then, how did you decide to create these direct relationships with the larger banks, or sort of like what drove you into that decision?
We think about direct relationships as always being the best option ultimately, because you can have a little bit more control over what happens between both in technical and business sense. But we started out working with Silicon Valley Bank. They were our first bank partner when we were in Y Combinator. We spent a lot of that summer really just building that first integration and trying to make sure that we can build it in a way that can be abstracted enough to support other financial institutions as well. And then we really have been following our customers, meaning when prospects come to us with a new bank that we don't support, but otherwise they have a perfectly good use case and have a desire to use Modern Treasury, we will at least explore and go talk to the new institution for us. And usually there's some interface that there exists at that bank, and we'll work over that interface, whatever it might be. So we make it relatively easy, I think, for our partners, because we're very flexible and we don't have a philosophy around how it should best work, other than we're promising a certain set of reliability and otherwise promises to our customers. But at the end of the day, really, our bank partners are very important to us, both in serving our mutual customers, right? So a lot of these companies are going to be customers of one or more banks, and they want to use Modern Treasury, and we have to be able to kind of all work nicely together to serve them and serve their needs of really building the best company that they can build. And then on the flip side, we can work with the banks to really bring them, more innovation, more customers. They can bring us customers, all that sort of thing. That just takes a life of its own and is different in every institution. But we ultimately very much believe like we have a place in the world, which is we want to be an independent software company focused on solving this problem. And banks have theirs, which is their financial institutions standing behind a lot of these accounts and these corporate clients. And so there's a way in which we complement each other and really serve our mutual customers best. And that's, I think, the makings of every good partnership.
I want to push a little bit more around this topic to give it color, because in a past life, I was doing integrations into investment custodians, and it was a special kind of pleasure. And I've gone through at that time every data aggregation approach, whether it's CSVs or whether screen scraping or whether trying to go through a third party. And then every custodian would have a different architecture to their data, and it is a very, very heavy lift. And then the other path I know of is integrating blockchains into a crypto wallet, which is more modern but similarly difficult, because each one comes with its own approach to computation, its own approach to accounting, its own approach to consensus, and so on. And so I'd love to hear, whatever you can share around the bank connectivity stuff. Like maybe an example of the best API, the cleanest technology, and you don't have to give names, but like what's the state of the art for a bank to allow like read write access to money movement, and then the opposite, like what's the jankiest, strangest, oldest version of that you've had to deal with?
Yeah, I mean, let me just preface that by saying that to some degree, what you just described is the value prop and a big part of the value of Modern Treasuries, that all this stuff you don't have to understand as a customer, as a prospect. When it starts dawning on some engineer, what are the kind of different complexities that can happen when you're integrating a bank or multiple banks, all of a sudden, this is where Modern Treasury hopefully becomes incredibly appealing, in saying, look, you don't have to worry about it. Here's a single API. We'll worry about the details of how that actually works with every particular financial institution. And I think just as importantly, it allows companies to have this approach that isn't just, go make one integration happen and then afterwards build the set of reporting and kind of one-off feature requests that then the ops and customer service and finance team come back with, because you can imagine that no engineering team builds the perfect UI for the ops teams when they first kind of do that first integration. And so the business starts humming before there's a way to really manage it and control it. And that's one of the problems that Modern Treasury can solve. But specific to your question, I mean, yeah, like we think about ourselves a little bit as this, bank integration, center of excellence. And that means that we can we have a lot of tooling around. We've seen a lot of patterns. We have a lot of technology that's already built for adding new types of connections, and they can range anything from SFTP based systems to APIs that can be REST, they can be SOAP, they can be really anything. And I think the other element of what you're describing is also not just that it's technically can be challenging, but it's also there's a process for onboarding and underwriting and getting a customer live at the bank that is more of an underwriting process than it is a technical process, and that can also take many days and weeks. So I mean, in terms of the best to the worst, I mean we've seen companies that have been able to go live with major banks in 48 hours, and we've seen companies that take 3 months or 4 months. And it's partly technical, although Modern Treasury can solve a lot of that speed of the technical implementation, but it's also partly this kind of relationship-based underwriting approach that sometimes takes longer than customers would like. So we're very focused on trying to solve both and trying to make sure that clients can come to the favorite kind of financial institution they want to work with, or come to us and kind of go from not a customer of a bank, not implemented, not live with an app, to kind of fully up and running in a matter of days. And I think that unlocks so much innovation and so much creativity and so on. But there's a lot of nitty gritty in there. So that's something that hopefully we can help unlock for the web economy, if you will, if we really solve this.
Yeah, and is it fair to say that your counterparty on the bank integration side is the wholesale part of the bank rather than the retail part?
Yeah, I mean, all of our customers today are corporate clients, and so different banks, are organized differently. It could be commercial or corporate or wholesale, but basically never the retail part of the bank.
Right, and that is also probably why some of the tech that they offer to you might be a bit better, because there might be an expectation that they have a more sophisticated counterparty that wants to connect to those hooks and so on. Can you talk a little bit about, in the time that you've been up and running, what change have you seen in the industry? What change have you seen in the temperature of the banks that you approach in order to do integration, as well as, if you've seen any change in the customer set that you have, whether the fintech itself and what it's trying to do sort of is reflecting something different than maybe kind of your original bet. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is, have you been surprised at all by the way that the business has evolved? And then similarly for your partners and your counterparties, have they undergone any digital transformation or any behavioral change as well over this time period?
Yeah, I think there's obviously been a ton of funding in fintech over the past 2-3 years. And I think that that's led to a couple of things. One is, I think I mentioned a little bit earlier, this thing about entrepreneurs' ambitions just growing, and people are really messing with industries they haven't messed with before. And I think that's something that's partly probably just the state of tech in the world. Part of it is probably driven by the pandemic, where certain very paper-based processes in industries like real estate or healthcare in the US have really been pushed to the limit or past the limit. And all of a sudden, a lot of the digital solutions become not just nice to haves and efficiency kind of gaining, but they're actually like the only way you can do certain things. And so I think that there's been maybe faster progress as a result of that than we had really thought. I think one thing that is clearly also true is, I think, as there's been a lot more focus and funding and progress in the fintech world from the kind of startup and VC side, if you will, I think banks have been more open to working with those companies. I think it's particularly true in crypto, where it used to be that most major banks just flat out wouldn't work with crypto clients, and that's changed pretty dramatically. And of course, we have companies like Coinbase that are just large public companies now. So I think that's been a big change. I don't know that it's unexpected necessarily, but it probably happened a little bit faster than most people would have thought. And then, the thing that I'm sort of most excited about is really watching our clients scale super quickly, because and there's a number of other infrastructure companies that are not even fintech related, but take away a lot of the day-to-day problems that used to be part of building a company. So when you think about the promise of software, it's just getting companies up and running as quickly as possible and going solving the problem they're kind of uniquely qualified to solve. And we think about, as we build our own kind of version of a best company that we can try to build, all of our clients are doing the same thing. And how do they not have to think about things like CRM or marketing automation or all these things. I think payment ops is another one of these, which is it can really, kind of bring a company to a halt and cause a lot of problems and a lot of thrash if it's not done right. And so if you can pick up a piece of software and just run with it, that's a pretty wonderful thing. So I think just seeing some of the clients of ours that we signed on early on in 18, 19, 20, really scaling at pretty unbelievable rates is really cool to see, because they wouldn't have been able to do it. I mean, I know from firsthand experience at Lending Home, like there's things that we would have been able to go so much faster if we just had Modern Treasury back then.
That's an incredible ride to be on. I want to close with a similar question to where we started, which is around product management. I mean, the company's been on this really fantastic, quick scaling journey, and you've got the compounding of the company and the compounding of your clients, which I'm sure puts immense and, if not unbearable, pressure on people, on systems, on recruiting, and so on. Can you talk a little bit about, back to this question of building a product and product management, and your approach to doing good product management, or designing an organization and scaling an organization that is able to build a beautiful performant product in such a hyper growth mode? Like, what are some of the learnings you have about being on this path and kind of retaining some of that DNA, that best practices DNA that gave you the insight to build the company? How can you bring that along into recruiting, into the organization, and into the culture as the company grows?
Yeah, we can talk about this question for another hour or more, but I think a lot of the same approaches in the way a product manager really has to be thinking about all the constituent pieces of the product really working. So how do I make sure that it's reliable? How do I make sure that it's designed well? How do I make sure that the customer, sees it at the right time in their kind of life and at the buying moment where they might experiment with it? And you have to kind of craft all the stuff that you can't, if one of those is not true, like the whole thing falls apart. And I think as a founder and as a CEO, you end up thinking about the company as your product. And so how do we make sure, again, that like we as a company are able to deliver on our core promise to our customers? How do we make sure that we're attracting, the best people into the company and making it a good place to work and making it, challenging, but make sure people don't burn out and things like that? How do we make sure that there is a element of innovation and surprise and so on associated with some of the product development that we're doing, that it's not just a feature requests from customers, which we obviously have to deliver on, but that we have the capacity to both as a product team, as an engineering team, as a company, to be able to invest in new things and experiment and accept failure. And sometimes things don't work and kind of move on from it. So I think that you get into this mode of, I think as a founder, where you're like sort of in the beginning, you don't have a lot of these functions. And so when you think about something like recruiting, it's like, let's go build a recruiting team. And you don't necessarily know anything about that. I mean, you have done it but by virtue of being a founder, but you're not an expert in that. And then you do the same thing with finance, and you do the same thing with sales, and you do the same thing with, team after team. And I think that's something that has been definitely a steep learning journey for me. I've really enjoyed it. But I think a lot of what allows you to scale is trying to not reinvent the wheel. And, I think there's major reasons for doing things like Y Combinator. And one of them is not during the summer or the winter batch that you're actually part of. It's like 3 years later when you need to find people who have done something and have seen companies scale past a certain point, and like what happens and what breaks and what do we need to think about. And none of the advice is literally applicable because it's a different situation, but a lot of it is very informative. And so at the end of the day, it's all about like the team and the people and the culture you're creating. And we know there's a lot of product surface area. We know there's a lot of problems and, let's just say, non-elegant things that happen inside of companies when it comes to B2B payments and to payment ops and things like that. So how do we make sure that we just create a culture of people who are excellent in their craft, who are empathetic, and then can go and learn about our customers and build products that solve those problems? And if we kind of do that on repeat, we'll continue launching new products and new experiences that should solve real problems. And I think value accrues to that over time. So that's kind of how I've approached it, and it's been a great ride so far. But it's very early days, and we certainly have a lot more to build.
Beautifully said. Thank you for that. If our listeners want to find out more about you or more about the company, where should they go?
So check out our website, moderntreasury.com. We're hiring, so you can go to the careers page and see open roles and more about us as a company. And I'm on Twitter. My handle is Dadiomov, Dadiomov. And so, yeah, feel free to reach out in DM or apply online if you're interested.
Fantastic. Dimitri, so good to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Hi, everyone. That's it for this week's episode of the FinTech Blueprint. For more technical deep dives into all things fintech and decentralized finance, check out fintechblueprint.com and grab a free subscription to the newsletter. This is Lex, and I'll see you next time.